Hello and welcome to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. Alabama is the national champion again. A unique season that was soaked in uncertainty ended with the most predictable champion. To recap the Tide's victory against Ohio State, the season, and to consider what is next for the Nick Saban dynasty, I will be joined by two guests, my friends Paul Myerberg and Dan Wolken from USA Today. This USA Today themed wrap up the season podcast has become a little bit of a tradition around here. The Crimson Tide conquered college football season in a pandemic with a perfect record and an all-time great offense, and there is no end in sight to their dominance. Thanks for listening to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. You can find us on Westwood One Podcast, Apple Podcast, just about anywhere you like to get your podcast. If you like what you hear, give us a good review and a good rating. It helps college football fans find us, and it helps us find more college football fans. And away we go. Joining me for the final AP Top 25 podcast of this college football season, the morning after Alabama has won the national championship yet again, number 6 under Nick Saban. Joining me are my friends from USA Today, Paul Myerberg. Paul, say hello so the folks can identify your voice.
This is my voice. Good morning.
Good morning, Paul. And Dan Wolken from USA Today also joining me. Dan, thanks for doing this morning.
Yeah, Ralph, didn't we do this a year ago at the Marriott on Bourbon Street? And boy, wasn't life a lot different.
Yes, I think this might become a tradition. Not this, like having you guys on seems like a good tradition. We may have even done it the year before. I actually may have even had one of your other colleagues involved in this. So the USA Today AP merger day after the championship game podcast is becoming a bit of a tradition. But yes, I would much rather be sitting with you guys, drinking coffee, looking out over Bourbon Street, or in this case, Miami, downtown Miami, as opposed to all of us sitting in different hotel rooms doing this via a virtual studio. But
hey, so guys, I thought about this, right? About how we did this a year ago, and my thought was not, "Oh, I wish we could have been together." It was, "Damn, I bet you there was a lot of COVID in that room," like early January last year, right?
That's a good
point. There's at least like a couple people walking around coughing and sniffling in early January and mid-January New Orleans.
Yeah, no, without question. It was definitely here in the U.S. before we realized it. It's without getting too deep into that muck. Around the championship game last year and the playoff last year was when my wife, who works as an epidemiologist and has been dealing with this for more than a year, first started getting, warnings. Essentially, the CDC was calling the New York City Department of Health saying, "Hey, you guys are going to have to mobilize. There's a potential pandemic heading our way from China." So that started right around the very end of 2018. Which she got like the first calls. I think we were in Arizona. She was with me covering while I was covering the semifinal. Anyway, again, we don't want to get too bogged down in that, but yes, it's very possible we were sitting in a room with COVID last year when we did this. And now we are here sitting in different rooms and surveying an Alabama championship. And I will go back to this, Paul. I want to start with you. Because last year we talked a lot about how what LSU had done was unprecedented. And it was one of the great offenses, one of the great teams in the history of college football. And you were one of the only people I remember pushing back on that a little bit and saying, no, this is the convergence of the best talent, which is what the top SEC schools usually have, and the best and most creative schemes. Like, this is the convergence of the SEC truly embracing the offensive evolution. And a year later, Alabama looked very much like that LSU team. I think we have seen your prediction to a certain degree come to fruition.
Well, yeah. I mean, first off, like that wasn't. That's not detract from LSU last year. Obviously, very good. And Alabama, I think, better this year. But LSU also obviously set the bar. Um, the history of college football. I mean, we've been on an offensive surge in terms of production increasing on an annual basis for 35 years. Really, since the early 90s, maybe late 80s. Every single year, you're seeing an uptick in yards per game, yards per carry, yards per attempt, scoring. And that trend just simply isn't going away. So when this hit the SEC and you saw the SEC fully embrace it, I just had the feeling, and it's obvious now that um, this is going to be the new normal. And every single year, you're going to see an uptick in production. This Alabama team was special because, in terms of talent, it's hard to imagine a team and an offense being more talented at the skill positions than this group was. But look, every time there is a surge in offense and a change in offensive identity across college football, there's never some sort of market correction. It's not like there's been a decade of offensive brilliance that then defenses figure things out and send things back to the drawing board for a decade. Offenses have ruled the sport for decades. That's going to continue to happen. And we need to become accustomed to the new normal being 40-40 football games, and that being the standard for this sport. That offenses are going to become so dominant, if as they already are, that there's no defensive hero waiting around the corner to address it. So we're seeing the beginning of it. Alabama did it great, but I don't know, Dan. I don't think it's coming down anytime soon.
Well, no, what I was going to say was if that's the case, like if that's where it's headed, then do you need to start changing the rules of the sport? Because I look, I enjoy a good offensive game as much as anybody, but I mean, if that's what it's going to be all the time, I'm not sure that that is to football's benefit.
But what do you do to change? Like, so the rules, I just use the NFL as the example. They changed pass interference rules to make things easier for offenses. And then they changed the way that you could tackle, which is obviously a safety issue, but had the byproduct subplot of improving things for offenses. I don't know what you do rules wise, regulations wise to aid defenses while also taking into account safety protocol. I don't know what that is. I agree with you. It would be great if they could do that because I think there needs to be more balance. I just don't know what there is possible to do while taking into account, targeting, tackling rules.
Well, I think you would have to start looking at man downfield rules in terms of kind of evening the playing field on some of these RPOs. Certainly, potential more contact. Redefine what contact is between a receiver and a defensive back. Like I think there's things you can do. There's always ways you can change the sport a little bit, tweak it. I just think an offensive explosion that never ends. I don't think that's not to quote the Nick Saban of old. Is that really what we want football to be?
Well, and think of it from this perspective. You wrote about Mac Jones last night, Dan, and Mac Jones almost got lost in the Devontae Smith. Between Devontae Smith, Saban setting a record, this kind of the culmination of a strange season through COVID. Mac Jones had a game every bit as good as Joe Burrow had last year and finished with a season that statistically very much looked like Joe Burrow last year. Now, I think Mac Jones has some limitations in his game that will he won't be the first overall draft pick. But I think to a certain degree, you can sort of see the evolution through him. Here is a very good player surrounded by great players, and he just ripped off this historic season, and it was sort of like, oh yeah, that happened too.
Well, I certainly would give him a lot of credit for that happening because as I have tried to impart from the beginning of watching Alabama, like somebody actually does have to throw that pass and has got to put it in a place where the receiver gets it and make sure it doesn't get intercepted and actually has to see the receiver open. Like there's a lot that goes into being the quarterback. So I can't just say that it's the system and it's having Devontae Smith and all that. Like I think Mac Jones deserves a lot of credit for what this Alabama team was. But I guess we'll see. Like in the future, they've got another great kid coming in next year, or I guess who's already on the roster, and Bryce Young, and I assume he'll take over the starting quarterback position. I think Alabama's not going to be looking backwards. They'll have somewhat of a different offense, I would imagine, because they're reportedly bringing in Bill O'Brien to run it because Sark's leaving. But I mean, to me, just what it's showing is that when you match up these really good offensive systems with the best skill players, which is what Alabama's always had, it does start to look really, really scary.
So, Paul, let me talk about a little bit, sort of glancing forward, because you touched on it here. I don't know if there's much more to talk about from last night. I mean, Ohio State ultimately was like as good as Ohio State is, and that's the thing. Ohio State is very, very good. I think defensively they were just ill-equipped to handle Alabama. Not that anybody is very well equipped, but the way they were short on defensive back depth and had to play a lot of linebackers, and at one point had Tough Borland trying to keep up with Devontae Smith, pretty much summed up where that game was heading. But Alabama is about to bring in one of the great recruiting classes of all time, at least if you pay attention to sort of the number crunching that 247 does. So this is not ending anytime soon. We have come to realize that this is just going to be the way it is with Alabama under Nick Saban. They are going to be great. I do think that there might be a window of opportunity next year for someone to get them, though. There might be a little bit of transition year next year for a quarter of a step back for Alabama. Maybe, possibly.
Yeah, I mean, obviously everything being relative. A quarter of a step back might mean they still win the West but don't win the SEC. That itself feels really unlikely. Like if they make the SEC championship game, they're obviously I would think going to win it. But I in the SEC, and you and I talked about this before the game last night. I think Georgia's got a really good football team next year, and I think bringing back JT Daniels and the way they played in the second half and the way that they responded offensively with Daniels under center, I think bodes well for their chances with a complete offseason and a number of players coming back who could have opted into the NFL or not come back for a senior year. So Georgia's an intriguing contender, and I think that Alabama, if they do take even a slight step back, Georgia is. I mean, look, they've been knocking on the door for every year of Smart's tenure except his debut. So it would make a lot of sense to me that if Alabama is unable to maintain this pace, which just seems unlikely because it would be, this was a historic season, that Georgia's there to pick up the slack and win the SEC. But look, if you got Alabama anywhere except for your top 3 or 4 in your poll heading into, coming out of last night, looking ahead to 2021, then you're doing it wrong, because clearly Alabama is going to be good enough again to win the national championship.
Dan, is there anything left to sort of be said on Saban here? I think we've already sort of conceded that he is the greatest coach we've seen in this sport, and this is the greatest dynasty we have seen in this sport. Are we just, or is the competition simply relegated to waiting him out till he finally retires, then decides to go do something else?
Yeah, I really think so. I think there was a couple years recently where it looked like he was struggling to recruit a little bit because of age concerns. And of course, it's all relative. They, instead of having the number 1 class, they have the number 5 class, right? But other schools, other coaching staffs were hammering him on age in recruiting, and it was working. And then, he tried to get a younger staff, and that sort of worked on the recruiting side, but maybe it went a little too heavy on recruiting. And I thought some of their just general, game planning stuff suffered a little bit. I thought you saw that maybe in the 2018 championship against Clemson, where it really kind of felt like their defensive coaching staff in particular was kind of overmatched. And now he's, I think, maybe recalibrated it a little bit. And obviously he'll have to continue to do it. Alabama loses coaches. They're going to continue to lose coaches. That's the price of success. But I really do think at this point, like, it's just not, if you're waiting for them to fall off a cliff or even to dip, that 1 degree that would maybe cause Saban to think about whether or not he wanted to continue doing it. Like, it's just not happening. He's going to continue for the foreseeable future. Like, there's really no end in sight at this point.
One more on the other participant last night, and I'll go to you, Paul, and that is Ohio State It seems like under Ryan Day they have almost advanced to where Urban had them, which is hard to gather or hard to comprehend because they were so good under Urban, and there was this they were so good last year, and then they get to the championship game this year beating Clemson. Do you think that we are in on the verge of sort of having Ohio State Alabama be what Clemson Alabama was for a few years? Is Ohio State Can Ohio State get to that level? That's what they sort of have been chasing, is that level. Clemson got there for a couple of years. I don't think Clemson's necessarily going away. Can Ohio State really truly get to Alabama's level, or at least get there on an odd year to be able to beat them?
Yeah, it's the second part, Ralph, because in terms of getting on their level, I understand it's one night, and they were a little bit shorthanded, and it's been a strange season. But from what I saw last night, Ohio State is not on the same level as Alabama as a program. Even against an elite Alabama team, they didn't look like they were in the same class at all. But yeah, that's the key. As Dan said, you're just not going to go toe to toe with Alabama and just supplant them. Like, even when Clemson was doing it and winning 2 out of 3 and playing them another couple times, it never felt like, well, Clemson's number one now. They're the juggernaut. It still was like, well, they can give Alabama all they can handle, and no one else could do it. So Clemson deserved our praise and plaudit. But Ohio State is not going to get there, and they're not going to be the team that is like shoulder to shoulder with Alabama. But from what we've seen under Day, his ability to develop QBs, their own recruiting, which is at a ridiculously high level, Ohio State is the team, along with Clemson, if you believe that is going to challenge Alabama every odd year, every 2 years, every 3 years, and be in this position. I think that's a safe bet. And obviously, we all know from the last couple of years of college football and this year, there's only so many teams every year who are going to compete for this. And if you really boil it down, there's only so many teams who every year you will say can win it. Ohio State is still on that short list. And I think that's 3 teams or 4 teams, and Buckeyes and Crimson Tide make up half of that group.
So Alabama is going to be on a tier almost to itself because they're probably better positioned to sustain this level of greatness. And while other teams might be able to there's still going to be a teams in the next very high tier that can take shots at Alabama. The thing that I think has sort of grinded the sport into a bit of a mire recently is there's not enough of those teams in the next tier. Ohio State is dominating the Big Ten. Clemson is dominating the ACC with no real competition. Oklahoma has been scared a little bit in the Big 12. There's less of a gap, though Oklahoma might be bringing back one of its best teams next year. The Pac-12 is still sorting things out, and maybe it could have one of those teams. Is that what we're missing here, Dan? Is there a possibility of, like, there are other programs who might be able to sort of get to this level at least occasionally, but even within these conferences, I feel like the reason why people are frustrated, fans get a little bit like bored, is because this all seems so inevitable, not only from a national perspective, but if you look at the regions, and by regions I mean conferences, it seems like there's only 1 or 2 within each conference that have separated themselves.
Look, I think the unintended consequence of the playoff is that it's become sort of a self-perpetuating cycle where teams that have gotten in the playoff consistently are able to go and recruit and say, we're getting in the playoff. This other school that you're looking at has not gotten in, or maybe got in once. We're getting in every year. Don't you want to come play for a program that's going to be in these games that everybody's watching? The only games that a lot of people care about in college football anymore. So that's one thing that I think is happening. But also I would say you have to kind of spin it forward at this point and look at what's going to happen when we get to the name, image, and likeness world, what's going to happen when we get to the kind of unfettered transfer world, which is already starting to some degree. Does that put those programs at an even greater advantage, or does it play to the favor of maybe some of the lesser lights where they can accumulate talent more quickly? I don't really know. I think it's up in the air as to how that's going to play, but you can't talk about this stuff without acknowledging that the world is about to change in a pretty major way.
Yeah, I do wonder if those are potential levers for parity. And listen, you're never going to have real parity in college football. A, there's too many teams. B, um, you can't build in rules like pro teams do as far as roster size and salary caps and drafts and things along those lines. But again, it does seem to have skewed one way, very hard one way. I do like the idea. I'm with you. I think that's one of the reasons why the playoff will expand. So the Pac-12 can say, come here and you can make the playoff. Not just schools, but the conference in general. And I do wonder if some of those other things, name, image, and likeness, and the transfers will disperse a little more talent to different teams and shave a little more off the top of some of these top teams. But Paul, I think at this point we all feel like expansion is inevitable. Have you, back of the napkin? I do this a lot these days because I feel like expansion is inevitable. I think we sort of assume maybe 8, but is there something more creative there that you've come up with?
Yeah, I do 130, and I give the top 2 seeds a bye, right? Does that math work? I was looking at the wild card stuff in the NFL. I spent like 45 minutes trying to figure it out. Like one team has a bye. 7. No, I mean, it'll be 8 and 5, 2, and then one group of 5 is I wouldn't say the expectation. That's my sincere hope, is that you get the best group of 5 team in there, even if you seed them 8 and make them play Alabama every year. I think that's good for college football. I don't know if there's room to do more than that, Ralph. I mean, there isn't. Honestly, the calendar isn't kind to college football. You can't go to 16 and push the year deep into January or start it in mid-August. So yeah, 8's the way to go. I do want to see a group of 5 on there. Dan, I don't know if you agree with that, but I think that'd be really good for college football. And I think, to speak to what Dan said about, there being changes coming to college football, obviously Dan is right, but I don't know if that's going to solve what I think of as the biggest issue right now with the sport, which is that we've destroyed like the idea of a middle class program in college football, because there's just no joy at winning 8 games anymore. Like winning 7 or 8 games is not cause for celebration, no matter who you are or where you are, because our standard for success is so skewed. So either you suck and you're the Jets and you're like, well, let's hire a first-year coach who's 26, who's really good at Madden, and let's rebuild with recruiting, or you're really good. And if you're not somewhere, if you're in between that at any point, you're not happy in college football, certainly on the Power 5 level, unless you're Indiana or unless you're Northwestern. So yeah, I mean, you might add more parity with the one-time transfer and the fact that you could be on a billboard in Dubuque for $20,000, but I just don't know if that's going to solve like a deeper emotional issue I think that college football is facing right now.
I don't know that there's one cure-all. I think it's just a matter of it's a matter of taking a hard look at everything, and I don't know that people actually want to do that. Like I think the fans of all these other programs look at it and say, boy, how can we really kind of rig this sport to level the playing field for us. But I'm just not sure that that's what the power brokers want. I've never really gotten that sense that anybody who's in a position to make decisions cares about that you've got 3 to 6 programs who are going to take up 95% of the playoff spots every single year.
Yeah, I think I feel like we talk about this and bring up the same programs all the time, but part of a solution, quote unquote, a solution is USC plays to its potential. Texas becomes a more legitimate threat to Oklahoma because it has conceivably with resources the ceiling to do so. Alabama has gotten so good that even the good SEC, the really good SEC programs are having a hard time keeping up. So that's a little strange. But, if Florida State becomes a contender again, it gives someone, it's a program that can see eye to eye with Clemson. Within the Big Ten, you would think Penn State or Michigan would possibly be able to see eye to eye from a talent perspective with Ohio State, but that seems to have really gotten away from those programs. And really it's more Ohio State has gotten away from those programs. So, I don't know. I think there's potential there for some teams to catch up and close the gap, but the gap is just so enormous right now in those conferences. So I guess what I wonder is if it's on some of these other potential superpowers to possibly start acting more like superpowers. That's not going to expand the group from 4 to 6 teams, much past maybe 6 to 10 teams, but at least it gives a little more, diversity, so to speak, to that top tier, and maybe get some different teams in there and get some different fan bases involved. Let me talk to you about, as we sort of wind down here, just to sort of put a cap on this season. Like, this has not, I described it with, I think, a couple people as from Monday through Friday, it kind of sucked. It was the season was just soaked in COVID at every turn. And then on Saturday, we would show up to game day, and in some ways the games would still be very enjoyable. And it felt like you would try to be a normal season and you'd try to have normal conversations about playoffs and Heismans and conference championships. But ultimately, everything was still soaked in COVID. I guess broad question, I'll start with you, Dan, is sort of, was this season worth it?
Yeah, and I think that's hard question.
Yeah.
Well, here's the problem. And what I've tried to do when I talk about this is to give some credit to the idea that everyone experienced this differently. Typically in a season, everyone plays their games, and how you feel about it at the end is determined by how successful you were on the field, how many wins you had, what bowl game you went to, and all of that. And there are some people who are satisfied with it and some people who aren't. This is a totally different kind of thing. And the experience of a team like Alabama was just vastly different. And not even Alabama, because they won the championship. I mean, let's just say Tulane. All right, Tulane ended up playing, I think, like all their games on time, right? Which hardly anybody did, right? And of course, their season was hard too. Like, they had to do all the testing and all that stuff. But like, compare that to, I wrote about a story about this the other day, like a team like Charlotte that had 9 games that were either canceled or postponed. At times, they were on the charter plane headed to a city and got the call and basically had to turn around. They were in Boca Raton in a team meeting 3 hours before kickoff and had a game canceled. So, how everybody experienced this and just the exhaustion, and also, I know that everyone likes to say, oh, nobody died, the hospitalizations. Hey, a lot of people got sick. A lot of people experienced COVID, and it was not pleasant, right? A lot of people had to deal with the anxiety of wondering whether they were positive or not. A lot of people had to go into quarantine and isolation because they got contact traced. Has the Joe fan out there had to go into isolation for 2 weeks? Like, that's not fun, right? That's not what anybody's idea of a good time is. So, I think it's just complicated. I think the whole season was complicated. Yes, they got to the finish line. I think there is some reason to feel like that's an accomplishment. But what was the actual cost of doing that? I think is unknown, both to the health of the people involved in the sport and the public health element of you saw in Tuscaloosa after the championship game, thousands and thousands of people flooding into the streets. Like, what is the result of that going to be from a COVID standpoint in a week or two? Like there's just all these things that are hard to measure. And so all I look at is it's complicated, and it's even more complicated by the fact that these are so-called amateurs, unlike the NFL where there's a clear sort of incentive and everybody knows what it is and everybody understands the risk and the level of precaution that you personally have to take, and what the kind of if things go wrong within a team, within an organization, like there's a very clear consequence to that. With college, there was none of that. It wasn't collectively bargained. Like there was no hazard pay or extra incentive for the players. It was kind of the same incentives they've always had. So that's what part of why I struggled with the whole season. And I just think success, not worth it or not. I just think it's a very, very complicated question.
Well, I'll bounce it to you, Paul, though. You feel free to steer it one way or in a different way. I mean, again, was it worth it or are you glad it's over? How about that? Did you gain some joy from this season? Did you feel at times that like, okay, I'm really happy we did this? Or does it even matter how you feel? Right? I mean, does it matter how I feel?
No, Ralph. No, it doesn't matter how I feel. No one cares. And you as well. No offense.
No, it's true.
But look, this was a miserable season. It was a miserable season. Miserable, not for coaches so much because they still got paid, and not for fans because 99% of fans watch from home anyway, and certainly not for the media because who cares about us? But this was a miserable season, as Dan said, for the players, and I don't know if I do know that there's a substantial disconnect between people who watch the sport and maybe even a number of coaches up until the end of the season between how they perceived the year went and how the experience was for student athletes. I think it was miserable for them. And I just like, if we could try just to like have someone understand, imagine going back to like 1 year of college and just having those memories stripped away. Like all those times you went out with your buddies or went and did this and all your social experiences, and just have those memories erased and how meaningful that would be and how hurtful that would be to you as a person. And that's what essentially happened for these players and will continue to happen through the spring because that's what campuses are going to be like. So I feel terrible about that for them. And I think you saw what it meant in late November, early December, when programs like Pittsburgh and Boston College went into a room with their coaches and players were asked who wants to play in a bowl game, and no one raised their hand. And everyone just wanted to go home and see their family and get something, have something nice. So that's my takeaway from this season. It was nice sometimes to wake up on a Saturday and watch football, but this is a miserable season, and let's never, ever do it again.
Right. And hopefully, I think there's a lot of hope that next season will feel a lot more normal. I don't know if we're going to have normal crowds, but I do think, from talking to people who sort of know these things, it's hard to predict the virus and you're not going to make any money betting on what the virus will do. But generally speaking, I think there's a lot of reason for optimism that next season in many ways will feel normal. And most importantly, it will feel more normal for the players. It was just what you're talking about. They won't be tested 4 or 5 times a week, most likely. That fear of like, is this the day I get tapped on the shoulder? Like Wyatt Davis had said, the great offensive lineman from Ohio State. He's like, it was just weird living through that. Is this the day I get tapped on the shoulder and told I'm done for 2 weeks? Right. And living with that fear was something that I think all the players dealt with. I think we will be past that next year. I think we will be playing non-conference games, and I think we will be playing, full slates starting on Labor Day weekend, and everybody playing the same amount of games. Again, I don't think it'll be completely in our rearview mirror. There still may be players testing positive, and maybe even some games disrupted, but I don't think we're going to have this. Again, I'm thankful to the players for putting up with this, and the coaches and everybody who sort of put a ton of effort to get this done, because I feel like, A, it's my job, and B, I gained some sense of normalcy and pleasure from having them play on those Saturdays. But yeah, it was to say it was enjoyable is it's sort of, you have to define enjoyable. So let's do this. Very last thing here is, I guess, Dan, what are you most looking forward to in what could be a more normal season next year? And also, let's put it this way. Again, I don't want to end on too much of a downer, but your sort of hopefulness that next year will look more what I just described, closer to normal.
Well, hopefully no more Zoom press conferences, because those things were awful.
Yeah, boy.
I mean, and again, like, not that Joe Fan cares about how we do our jobs, but like, it's just not a great way to communicate, and that's part of what we do in our jobs in producing content. Is you try to communicate. You communicate a question, somebody communicates an answer. What you hope is that you have, when you're face to face with somebody, and the opportunity to sort of talk to them as people, that there will be some sort of human connection formed that allows you to have a productive exchange of ideas. It's impossible to do that over Zoom when you're asking like one question. And so I think everybody who is a journalist who's written about college football has done their best and done a great job of doing this under difficult circumstances. But trust me, the content suffers as a result of not actually being able to talk to people.
What you're looking forward to next season, Paul?
Yeah, the Zoom calls have been really bad. They were really bad yesterday at the game. I don't know if you guys had an opinion on that. They were really bad. I always find like the most enjoyable part, or at least like the part that is like the most unique and makes this job, and this is kind of specific, but makes this job fun, is like getting to a game day on a Saturday when it's a really good game, and you're walking from your car to the media entrance, and then you're on the field until like 28 minutes before kickoff, and there's a hum in the stadium, and maybe it's like 7:25 and it's a little bit dark out, and the music's playing and people are going crazy. Those are the kind of environments and emotions that couldn't be replicated this season and that are really unique to this sport. So I'm hopeful, Ralph, like you said, that maybe there won't be the fans in the crowd to have that, but hopefully we get close enough to normal and we're all still employed and we're still going to games, and I could get that experience back, because that's really special. And anyone who has had that moment can attest to it. That's just part of the fabric of college football.
Dan Wolken and Paul Myerberg both work for USA Today. They cover college football nationally, and they do a great job. They're also my friends, and it was good to actually get a chance to see you both in a press box yesterday. It had been a long time for that had happened. I know all of us have gone to very few games this year, but again, it was good catching up with both of you in person, even if it was from behind a mask and with a little distance in between us. Thank you very much for doing this, guys. And I'm going to pencil us in for another season wrap up the day after the championship game podcast next year, when the title game, I believe, is in Indianapolis. So maybe that'll be fun. It'll be freezing. That'll be a little different. That'll be a little different way to cover this thing. But yeah, I'm penciling you both in again for next year.
Sounds good, man.
Sounds good. Fingers crossed.
And now 3 and out. First down. The final AP poll of the 2020 season hit the wire late last night. And by late last night, I mean right after, about an hour and a half after the Alabama-Ohio State game. And I think the most notable part was not necessarily the powerhouse programs at the top of the rankings. Other than Texas A&M creeping up to number 4 ahead of Notre Dame, there were no big surprises. There were, though, 8 teams from outside the Power 5 conferences ranked in the final poll, including 2 Sun Belt teams in Coastal Carolina and Louisiana in the top 20, and 2 MAC teams, Buffalo and Ball State, toward the bottom of the rankings. I understand the truncated seasons by the Big Ten and the Pac-12 plus Power 5 conferences, mostly playing league games, were part of the reason why some of these Group of 5 teams ended up ranked the way they were. The weirdness of the season contributed to the final results, and I'm not sure we'll see another season or final poll like this one. But if all of it helps in some way push forward more and better opportunities for these schools to show that they can compete against Power 5 schools, that could be a good thing for college football. Second down, this was supposed to be a big week for NCAA reforms, but the brakes got slammed on potential legislation for name, image, and likeness compensation and transfer rules. A warning from the Department of Justice about potential antitrust violations accelerated the momentum toward postponing votes on those items. I think eventually those things will get done. I actually think the DOJ did Mark Emmert and the NCAA a favor in this case. There is so much uncertainty with where NIL rules might go because Congress needs to weigh in, and now there's a Supreme Court case involving the NCAA that will be heard this summer. The NCAA was holding to a self-imposed deadline of passing legislation this week merely to show it was being proactive. But the fact of the matter is the NCAA and college sports have now relinquished some of their autonomy by asking federal lawmakers for help on this issue. Passing legislation would have been more symbolic, I think, than productive. Third down. And finally, thank you. Thank you for listening to this podcast this season. I hope it has informed and entertained you during a year that kind of sucked and during a college football season that might not have been as satisfying as usual. The season has been a grind to cover, and while I am so thankful to have this job that I love and really like doing this podcast as part of that job, even this was a grind at times. I often found myself a little distracted and not as prepared as I would have liked to have been because of the relentless torrent of news. Striking a balance between keeping it light here on the show and talking ball and trying to cover all the disruptions and turmoil was not necessarily easy. I hope I did okay. I'm glad a college football season was played, but that the season was just slathered in COVID, that playoff and Heisman debates became intertwined with the virus was kind of a drag. But when the games were played, they still provided a lot of good times. So thanks for making this podcast part of your season. We'll keep going weekly through most of the off season, and hopefully with a return to normal, I can come up with some creative and fresh ideas to make the show even better in 2021. And that's it for today. I'd like to thank my producer, Sarah McCrory, for making me sound good. You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts and Westwood One Podcasts. Please subscribe so you don't miss an episode. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. Thanks for listening, and come back for more next week. Maybe next week. I might have to take a little time off, but come back for more soon of the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast.